Welcome back, everybody. We're going to start with Unit 7 this week. We are now officially halfway through the course. Our midterm exams are going to be in the books here pretty quick. First impression that I've got is everybody's doing really well. So thank you for that. It looks like things are starting to catch and people are getting the idea. And if you're not, certainly contact me, as several people have, and we talk it through. But we're going to start talking about the regulatory environment, and that takes on really three distinct, different features, if you will. And we'll talk a little bit about what a regulation and a standard and a control have both in common and separately, so you understand what level of priority you need to put on these things when you do your risk assessments. So I'd like you to think about a world without a regulatory environment at all, without regulations and laws. It would be pretty chaotic. And, even if we took half of the laws away, even if we kept all the criminal laws, we still would have a chaotic world that would be full of corruption and pollution and other things that do us harm as a society and as individuals. So, we really do need to have certain regulations. Now, there are some who believe we are overregulated and some believe we need more, and that is all an opinion and personal preference and someone's political leanings, perhaps. But in general, you need to have a certain set of standards and regulations by which we all live. And I think we all can agree on that. The regulations are generally supported by administrative law in some way, strict regulations. So it doesn't require an act of Congress like most laws do to be enacted, or an act of a state legislature, but an administrative agency can enact a law. And most people had learned over the course of their civics classes that most laws are enacted by an act of Congress or a legislative body. But let's take the DEA, for example. They can add a drug to the schedule list on a moment's notice. If they find something in a raid somewhere and say, we've never seen this before, and we're finding a lot of dead bodies around this particular drug we just found, they can add that compound very quickly to a schedule until such time as they determine where it belongs, if it has medicinal value, and if it needs to be legal or illegal at all. So administrative law is something that is much quicker to enact and much easier to enact, quite frankly. And much of the regulations that we deal with, at least in the United States, are enacted through administrative law. There's often security components to those things. The example I used of the DEA, they would automatically put that substance they find onto a schedule, temporarily onto Schedule 1, perhaps, to say it has no medicinal value and it can do us harm. And now there's a security requirement around that. If there are components to that, they may tell people who have that compound for another reason to protect it in a certain way. But those regulations aren't always security-centric, and that's something that is really a challenge for security professionals, because they come in forms of regulations on other people. So there could be a regulation that says, in fact, there is a regulation that says that personally protected information needs to be protected in a certain way. And not just the IT folks have that, but HR may have that in their files. Therefore, they have a security component to what they do in the need to physically protect hard copies of files that contain personally identifiable information. So those types of things come up often. And unfortunately, you don't always know they're coming up. So we're going to try to go through some methodology of how to discover what's out there that can go bump in the night, if you will. There are also some voluntary standards and compliance programs, and those are normally tied to a certification of some kind. And it's good for companies and sometimes to have these certifications so that they can assure their customers and the people they do business with that they uphold a high standard. But they're normally not supported by law. With the exception of some international law, and we'll go over that in a bit. But for the most part, standards are imposed because a company wants to show a higher level of compliance to their customers. And then we have internal controls that really define your business to your customers and let them know that you have the same quality standards everywhere and that you uphold those standards so that your customers feel comfortable with your product. Let's go over what the difference between a regulation and a standard and an internal control is for the purposes of our discussion. And I say that because you will find that some government regulations call themselves standards, and some standards call themselves requirements or regulations, and many internal controls call themselves standards because they are an internal standard. The terminology can get confusing. So we're going to stick to a terminology for our course that's defined in this way. Regulations have clear legal consequences. You have penalties. If you don't comply with the regulations, somebody could go to jail. Somebody could pay a big fine. There could be a consent decree, which basically tells the regulatory agency you can come in anytime you want, with or without a warrant, and inspect our records, our operations, our properties, and you sign off on that to avoid a jail sentence or a fine. It could be forfeiture. They may say that we're going to take all of your product or all of everything that you have and shut your company down. It's almost always nation or state based, and by state I mean United States states, right? So this really doesn't include international regulations for businesses that are U.S. based in our definition. So think regulations, somebody could go to jail, you could pay a very hefty fine, and someone could come and shut your business down. For standards, they have operational consequences, okay? So you're asking a standardization organization to certify you, to say that you are an ISO 9000 certified manufacturer, that you do things in a certain way, certified by the, you see it on the advertisements on TV for vitamins, certified by PSP. I don't know what PSP is. I think it's some sort of a organization that certifies vitamin manufacturers for quality, but I see that in advertisements all the time. You asked to be certified by these places so that you can assure your customers that you have certain quality standards in place that are recognized and have some meaning. The penalties, if you don't uphold that, is normally your certification goes away. And that will tell your customers loud and clear that you're not adhering to the standards that you so loudly emphasized. But you're probably not going to jail, and you probably won't pay a fine unless that's part of an agreement with some certification organization, and that would be very rare. So regulations, you go to jail, pay a hefty fine, you're breaking the law. Standards, you are breaking a trust that you have with a certification agency. You said you would uphold these standards, and they gave you a seal of approval, and you could break that, and you could lose the seal of approval, which may impact whether or not you could sell your products in another country, because in some cases, and you'll see, the certification is required to sell things internationally, because that way the other country knows that you have held their standards up as well when you produce the material. Then you have internal quality controls, and those are self-defined. We say we are going to produce things in a certain way. We're going to produce them the same way every time so that you get a quality product. And if we don't do that, then the quality of our product goes down. It may not make that product unusable. It may not make that product unsellable by any stretch. It just might tell customers that they don't like our product anymore because we don't make it the same way every time. And that hurts our reputation, hurts our sales, and our viability in that way. So those are the three definitions we're going to use for this course. Again, you'll see that the terms are sometimes used interchangeably, which is not a good thing, but there's no way to control it. So for this course, understand those three definitions. Are regulations, standards, and controls important? And I would say they are. And I want you to look at some of these examples, and we'll go through them in that order, regulations, standards, and controls, to see where each one of them has a place in our business and how each one of them can be important to the viability of an organization. So way back early in U.S. history, President Washington asked then Commerce Secretary Jefferson to come up with a standard for weights and measures. Why would we do that? Because there was no real legal definition of what a pound or a meter or a kilo was. It was defined in other places, but let's just say that in Pennsylvania an inch is one measure, and in New York it's another. And I go to buy a size 32 pair of jeans, which I must be buying for somebody else because I couldn't even squeeze one leg in those suckers, but nonetheless, I go to buy those jeans, and I buy them in New York, and I get them back to Pennsylvania, and they don't fit anything like the ones I buy in Pennsylvania because an inch is not an inch is not an inch. Think about how hard it would be, even within a state, if an Erie inch was different than a Pittsburgh inch. So we need to have some regulations, some standards, let me rephrase that, some regulations, which are standard, to tell us what things mean to every person. Standard definitions would be a good way to describe a regulation in this case. And it's not just clothes. A pound of sugar, distance in miles. How many miles is it from campus to your home? Well, if my mile is 200 feet and yours is 5,280 feet, 5,820, no, 5,280 feet, then how long is a mile? A mile is defined. There's a regulation that says what a mile is. And based on that are speed limits. So regulations ensure compliance with laws and ensure we're protected in a uniform way. And the part about compliance with laws is the part that you really must remember. So let's look at a few regulations. Examples. The Americans with Disabilities Act. It tells us things like how wide a doorway needs to be so a person in a wheelchair can get free access through that doorway. It tells us how steep a ramp can be so a person with a physical challenge of walking can get up and down that ramp. It gives us certain regulations so that people with disabilities and challenges are protected under the law and have the same opportunities that you and I have. It's a regulation. It must be adhered to. And if you don't adhere to it, you can be cited and fined and potentially shut down if you have a commercial business because you have an ADA violation. Imagine if the local Best Buy store had a doorway that was only 25 inches wide. You and I could probably get through there unless we were in a wheelchair, which would require a 30-inch or 32-inch entrance. And those people would be excluded from shopping at the Best Buy, and that in and of itself is a violation of law. It's a violation of administrative law because the Americans with Disabilities Act specifies that commercial buildings must have certain things in place to accommodate, but the actual sizes of how big the openings need to be and the nuts and bolts of it are part of an administrative law. The Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standards, and be careful of the wording because there again, it's called a standard, but it is a regulation, tells companies that deal with chemicals that may be of interest to terrorists, how much they may store, what concentrations they may store it in, and if they need to have higher levels or higher concentrations, how they must protect those chemicals. That is a law, and if the Department of Homeland Security comes in to do an inspection, if you're a chemical inspector, you come in and you find a company has too much of a chemical that they said they wouldn't store and have it in too high of a concentration without the proper protections in place to make sure that it is not available to those who should not have it, then you could be shut down. That would be a regulation. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, so Part 326 of the Banking Act, tells us that security for banking facilities must be done in a certain way. The FDIC insures our deposits. So, and I think we'll go over this a little later in the lecture, but it insures deposits if you put money in the bank and that bank goes bankrupt, if you will, just closes their doors and leaves the country, the FDIC would return your deposits to you through an insurance program that they run up to a certain amount. I believe it's $125,000. After that, then you are on the hook. So people with more than that normally separate into separate accounts at separate banks and diversify a little bit. But those regulations are in place and to make sure that the banks themselves are protected so that if someone came in and robbed that one branch bank, that local bank, that the bank couldn't then go insolvent and the FDIC would have to pay out the insurance. So they have certain regulations they say you must adhere to be a bank. You must have the teller's window must have two-way glass. If it has two-way glass, it must be of a certain thickness. If not, it must have cameras in place, and there must be lighting on the vault at night. And you'll read this as part of the reading this week. It's a very short regulation, but it gives you a great idea. It's really a good regulation to kind of know in the back of your mind. Reason being is that even though I'm not in the banking industry, facilities I've worked at have had credit unions and banks branches in the buildings, and I've had to design those, so I had to become familiar with the banking regulations. So it's just kind of a gee whiz neat kind of piece of information as well. But remember that regulations are supported by a law of some kind in all cases. If it is a legal requirement that you do something, and you could be fined and or jailed for not doing that, it is definitely a regulation when we're talking about the regulatory environment of business. Standards are not applicable to all businesses. They're not applicable alike. So while all businesses would have to adhere to the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are standards that don't require businesses to adhere to them. And it's generally a voluntary compliance to give your company or your organization a competitive edge. So asking a certain certification body to certify my factories to say that they all adhere to, using nothing but spring water, right? Those of you who may remember Coors, when it first came out, used Rocky Mountain spring water. Well, in order to prove that to people, they would get a certification, and then they would have a body come in and test all of the water to ensure that it met certain quality standards, and they could make that claim. And they did this voluntarily because, after all the advertising dollars spent on we only use Rocky Mountain spring water, if it was found that they used East River water from New York, it would probably hurt their sales. Some standards might be required to do business in some countries. And I say this because if you make a product in the U.S. to a certain standard, you may be able to sell that in the UK or vice versa. But we have different standards. For the longest time, British cars had a different glass standard than American cars. And if you imported a British car, your glass was not laminated in the same way, and it could cause significant injuries. And since then, auto manufacturers have gone to an ISO standard for manufacturing, and the glass that is put in cars made in the UK is also applicable and legal to use and provides the same safety rating in the US. And so through an ISO standard and allowing themselves to be inspected by this body, which is an independent non-government body that certifies that they've used the correct glass, their cars are now available for sale in the US without modification. They can be as important to a business as legal regulations when it comes to the revenue and viability of the business. Because if indeed you don't have certain standards sometimes, customers will look at you and just say, you know what, why would you bank somewhere that didn't have FDIC protection? Even if you were to put $10 in the bank. If indeed that was not it was not a regulation, but it was a standard. It was just something they could do. Why would you do that? Because if the bank got robbed and the money was all gone, you'd still get your money back. Whereas if someplace wasn't insured, you wouldn't. That's the type of thing standards do. They give people assurance. They're not supported by a federal state law, but they might be supported by an international law, or the reason they may be in place is to help comply with an international law. Regulations supported, always supported by a law. Standards not always supported, might be supported by an external law here and there, but for the most part they are not. They are voluntary compliance to show you uphold a certain standard, and you use that in business to enhance your business standing. Want a great example of a standard? How valuable is your Slippery Rock University degree to you? Slippery Rock University is accredited by the Middle States Commission on Higher Learning to award degrees. Without that accreditation, you cannot apply for most civil service jobs. You would not get into many grad schools or any quality grad school. And your degree to most employers would be not applicable. In fact, when you see the requirements for a degree in most job postings, it says degree from accredited university. Those are regional accreditations in the U.S. And without that accreditation, you're not getting any financial aid. You may not get a job. Your degree is pretty much worthless. An unaccredited school doesn't have that. There was a school called Breyer State University, and it was founded, I believe, in Idaho, and its home state of record was Alabama. And they were essentially enrolling students with promises of a great job. And Breyer State University certainly sounds like a state university. But there was no legal requirement to not call yourself a state university if you were not state-owned in Alabama. And so Breyer State University set up shop and sold degrees from their headquarters in Idaho and charged students a lot of money. And these students had this bachelor's degree that they got for certain life events and a couple of online classes. And they presented that degree, and people said, yeah, that's not accredited. We can't accept it. So there's a standard. The Middle States Commission on Higher Learning accredited Slippery Rock University, and therefore your degree is considered regionally accredited, which is the highest standard in U.S. education, a regional accreditation. And when you hear about the university being accredited over the years, it's really important to you, because without that accreditation, your degree worth goes considerably down. And in fact, every alumni. So having the university accredited through your entire lifetime is important to you, because once that accreditation is lost, it can be reaccredited, but it takes an awful lot. And thankfully this school has no issues with accreditation. They've always done really well, and accreditation is it's a given. But there are schools that don't have it. So those schools don't meet that standard from that body. They weren't required to call themselves a university and to issue a degree. They weren't required to have that accreditation, but their product is next to worthless. Whereas you have a product that has a standard that issues an accreditation, and your degree has clear value. So there's a great example of what happens when you don't have standards in certain fields and the importance of keeping those standards up. Here are two examples of organizations that issue such standards, besides the higher learning commissions, and there is a southern one and a western one, I believe, and middle states for the accreditation of universities. But the National Institute of Standards and Technology, it's non-regulatory. It issues standards across the board on a whole lot of things. They do a lot of cybersecurity stuff now, but they issue standards on a whole lot of things. And a NIST certification may be required, I don't want to use the word required, may be very advantageous if you want to do business with the U.S. government. In not all cases do you need to have a NIST certification to do business with the government, but in certain fields, in certain types of projects, that NIST certification is going to be on the list of credentials that you need to have to do certain projects. So the National Institutes of Standards and Technology is part of the Department of Commerce, but it's considered a non-governmental agency as far as regulations are concerned, and it issues a credential and issues a set of standards that you can prove that you adhere to. The International Organization for Standardization, otherwise known as ISO, has been around for a very, very long time. Again, a non-governmental international organization, has 164 member countries, and they do voluntary international standards so that when you trade across the world, when you say you're going to get a pound of something, you get a pound. When you say you want certain types of materials, you get those materials, and you know that that organization, that company in that foreign country adhered to a certain standard to produce it, so you know you're getting what you asked for. Those are just two. There are plenty of them out there. Those two, ISO especially, does a whole lot of standards across the board, and again, that's another reading assignment this week. You'll see just a few of those, but they do just about everything. You can get ISO certifications in many, many, many different types of commercial operations. NIST, again, is more U.S.-based and is really concentrating on the technology side, but not just technology as in cybersecurity, but technology as in manufacturing technology and automotive technology and other things. Finally, we have internal controls, and those are self-imposed. Now, internal controls for you fraud majors may mean things you do to comply with the law. Internal controls for the purposes of our discussion are things that are self-imposed. These are internal quality controls that you put in place that you will adhere to so that you can assure your customers that they can have confidence in your products. It can create a competitive edge. Okay? Some of those things might be protected or have trade secrets, but they're not otherwise supported by law. And there's a higher burden of proof, and international enforcement is almost impossible when it comes to trade secrets. So they're not patented in many cases. They're just ways you do things. A great example of internal controls and trade secrets was New Coke. Back in the 1980s, early 90s, Coke came out with New Coke. They'd been doing the Coca-Cola recipe the same way for 150 years. And all of a sudden they came out with New Coke. And they put a big advertisement campaign out for New Coke, and the formula had changed, and the formula was protected. They hid it. They did not share the formula with anybody. And New Coke hit the shelves, and it was soundly rejected by just about anybody who took a taste of it. It was not Coca-Cola, and it was not very good. They turned around and reissued the old Coke recipe within about a year and a half. Some people believe it was a big marketing campaign just to get people hyped up and refresh enthusiasm around Coca-Cola itself. But others in business school just believe it was a major, major issue, or a mistake, rather. So, but the internal controls around Coca-Cola are that they have a proprietary formula to make Coca-Cola, and they have a proprietary way to make it, and they don't tell other people. But you know when you open up a can of Coca-Cola today, it will taste just like the last one you had. There's no variance there. Those internal controls create a stability of product because you do things the same way every time, and you get the same result. And you do that through quality controls that you put in place that you say everybody is going to adhere to. So let's look at some examples of that. if you've ever eaten at a KFC, otherwise known as Kentucky Fried Chicken, I think they shortened that to take the fried word out, but they advertise 11 herbs and spices that they use. That's not a trade secret anymore because those herbs and spices have been basically patented, and you can read the patent and you know what's in there. You have to adjust a little bit, but you can find the recipe for their chicken online in 100 different places, right? But they use it for consistency. Can you imagine if you went to a KFC and you had lunch and you enjoyed it? Although anybody who's eaten a KFC understands that you really enjoy it when you eat it, and an hour later you don't. But you really enjoyed it. So you're on the road somewhere and you see a KFC and you say, time for lunch, I'm going to go in KFC. And you went in there and they used a whole different amount of spices and different spices in it and made it totally different. And it was absolutely horrendous. When you saw that third KFC a week later and it was time for lunch, you probably would keep driving because the lack of consistency, the lack of internal controls has made a product that you don't have confidence in. So therefore, the internal controls have failed and you're not going to go there. Nike uses standard markings. You see the swoosh on a Nike, you understand it's a Nike, right? That might be copyrighted, but there are 100 different models of Nike in different colors and those kinds of things. There are other things that Nike does that ensure that you know it's a Nike sneaker, right? The insides are the same. The arch is the same. There's different styles, but you can understand what Nike does. And when you see Nike, for better or for worse, you make a quality decision. If you see a sneaker that is, brand X from Payless Shoes, sitting next to a Nike from Dick's Sporting Goods, and you say which one is probably better for your performance on the court or for your foot health, you will probably pick Nike, and there's a reason you do that. It's not just the advertisement, it's the consistency in the product over years that is proven to at least superficially improve people's performance on the playing field and to be more comfortable for people to wear. Slippery Rock University uses their seal and their word mark. The signs that you see out front of the university, the logo on your ID card and on the things in the bookstore. Many of those are copyrighted, but they're also done in a certain way. And if you look on the standards, which they call them standards, again, they're internal controls on the use of the word mark and the seal. The university is very particular about who uses the seal and how they use it. They don't want to see the university seal out on an advertisement for, a vape shop somewhere, right? They don't want to see that seal. That shop can say, we're very close to Slippery Rock University. There's not much you can do about that. They don't want to see the Slippery Rock seal used that way. So they protect it by both copyright and a set of standards internally that make sure we all use it the same way. So you won't see me put the Slippery Rock University logo on a syllabus in pink because it is not authorized in pink. It is used in either black or gray or green. And those are the standards that they want us to adhere to so that everyone sees that and relates it to the university and understands that that's a quality product. So internal controls are self-imposed. No certification organizations coming to check up on you. You do it that way because you want your product to be good and be equally good every time and make sure your customers understand they're going to get the same thing every time. All great discussion, Dr. Wisniewski, but what the heck does this mean for me as a security manager? Well, there's a high likelihood as a security manager that you will be named as the legally responsible person in a regulation somewhere in your organization. You need to understand what regulations govern security practices across your organization. So the reason is that not all of those controls, standards, and regulations are very specific to security. So in the case of the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, the security manager gets those right away because that's purely a security-driven regulation. But let's look at a standard like SHRM. We've read some stuff from the Society for Human Resources Management before in this class. That is a standards organization that may certify the people who work in your HR department. They get a certification, and in that certification says they do things in a certain way, and one of the things they do is protect information. It's part of the certification, part of the certification test that they take. Therefore, if they don't protect things in the right way, they could lose that certification. So there's a security component to what the HR person does that may impact how you protect their stuff. let's look at the IT department. If they have a NIST certification because your organization does some government work, there are physical security components of the NIST certification for cybersecurity around data centers and data collection points. Therefore, if you have a NIST certification for your IT department as the physical security manager, you need to understand that because you are responsible for the physical security components of that data center, and you need to make sure that you do them in the way that NIST says they need to be done, or you could lose that certification. And in that case, with that standard, right, because there's a certification, you lose the NIST standard, you could lose that government business as well. So you really need to understand the standards, internal controls, and the regulations. At your enterprise, the regulations will most likely jump out at you, but those other ones are hidden a little bit, and they might surprise you. So wait a minute, how do I know that my HR department has SHRM certification, or that my data center is required to have a NIST certification to do the government work? I'm not an IT guy and I'm not an HR guy. I am the lowly security manager. And the way you find this out is you ask. And this is where the whole enterprise security risk management setup pays the dividends. Because remember, you're going to invite important partners. We discussed directly HR and facilities and engineering and finance. But also the important partners in any organization would be potentially IT, if you have an IT department. Most places do. It might be R&D, it might be manufacturing, could be supply chain. Any of the important departments that you have will be invited to your ESRM committee, right? Your team, your process, however you set it up. And we talked about different ways to set it up, either a committee with votes or a committee with no votes or individual interviews. But your ESRM, where you're going out and finding the risks, that's where you find out what regulatory standards and internal quality commitments have been made by that person, so that you can then incorporate that into your security program. So the only way you're going to find out about these things is to ask. I will tell you from personal experience, early in my career, I was burned more than once where someone had promised a regulatory agency that they would watch security in a certain way. They did not do that, and it came back to bite me. The kinds of questions you need to ask when you sit down with those ESRM partners, either individually or in a group, is about their functions. Does their function have any mandatory legal responsibilities with a security interface, right? We're talking about regulations. What regulations might they have that have a security component in them that you may not know about? Again, most of those you will know about because they're pretty evident normally by the type of business that you work in. But ask, always ask, is there anything that we do? What do we do here that has major regulations attached to it? So again, I work in pharmaceuticals. So the FDA is a big player where I am, and therefore I need to understand some of the FDA regulations, also the DEA regulations, because we store controlled substances. So the supply chain people and the R&D people and the manufacturing people have to tell me what parts of the FDA regulations apply and that have a security component, or at least what parts they have to comply with. And they'll be able to tell you under the Code of Federal Regulations what code and what part they are required to comply with. They'll be able to tell you what the law number is, and then you need to go in and look it up and see, is there a security component in here that I need to be concerned with? That will cover you on the regulations if you ask every major player. You also need to ask if there are any certifications or endorsements by accreditation firms, societies, bodies, anything like that, and then get into a discussion about, are there any security requirements? And again, you may need to go in and do some research on this. Again, the HR department may have certification. The IT department may have a certification, and in those certifications, there may be some security requirements that during the certification process, the HR person or the IT person answered the questions for the certifying body, and those answers were accepted at the time. This is the danger here, is that the certification may already be in place, but the security components are iffy at best. So if you already have a certification, don't make the assumption that the security components are already covered because you got the certification, somebody looked it up. Remember, an inspection is only a cursory look at things, and they may have simply asked, do you have, is there only one badge allowed to access the card reader on the IT room? And the person said yes, and the inspector checked okay, and you find out when you look it up that 50 different badges will access that room. They may not have gone to the level of inspection but the next inspector might. So you need to understand what those are. And then you need to understand from a quality issue what types of things may be problematic, right? So this is the internal controls. And each person will tell you what keeps them awake at night, and that can give you some hints to the internal controls. So, is it the finished goods or raw materials that need protection? Maybe there's not a requirement to protect. I will tell you that I had a factory one time that made the Emergen-C. You see it on TV. You take it sometimes when you're traveling. It's got, it's a vitamin fizzy drink. And the vitamins that go in that are really concentrated, and they come in gallon drums. And there's just a few gallons available, if you will, in the factory at any particular time. There's a lot of sugar and flavorings and things that go into the fizzy drink part, but it's really highly concentrated vitamins. And those were a proprietary mix of vitamins that needed to be protected. And just those gallon jugs were worth more than most of the machinery in the factory because of that proprietary blend. So that was a real internal control on protecting those, so even they wouldn't have any incidental harm. No one would knock the gallon jug off the shelf, break it, and we would be out that week's worth of raw materials. Another one that you might find interesting is Viagra is a very highly counterfeited product for the company that I work for. And anybody can press a pill. You can actually go and buy pill presses on the secondary market. There may be some on eBay if you go look. There's definitely some supply houses that sell secondhand pill presses. And you get some dyes made, and you can make pills. It's not legal, by the way. I'm not recommending it. But we have found rogue makers in Latin America who made antibiotic-looking pills out of drywall dust, road paint, and floor wax. And people were buying them. That's easy to do. The harder part is to mimic the packaging, because the foils have certain look to them, certain features. There are holograms on the boxes in some cases that are very hard to reproduce and very expensive to reproduce. And by the time you went through the expense of doing that, if you're only doing it for a small amount because you're a counterfeiter, you're not making the volume that the real company's making, it becomes cost ineffective for you to counterfeit that product. So protecting the foils and protecting the packaging and the printed materials that go inside of it is as important as protecting the raw materials and the finished product itself. And I would have never thought that, but the internal controls on that packaging material is highly important for us to be able to tell people that they're taking the real thing, because on the box there's a hologram and on the foils there's certain features. And if they call and say, I think I got counterfeit product, we can talk them through it. We can get pictures and we can tell pretty close whether or not the product in that original packaging is original or not. So asking those questions, I would take these questions if I were you. Cut and paste them somewhere. Keep them in your portfolio for when you get that first real job, because those are real important questions to ask, because they are very important in the ESRM meetings to ask those questions to ferret out the regulations, the standards, and the internal controls that may have a security component that you really need to attack. A couple of other tactics to be successful in this realm, to understand the regulatory environment at your place of business, is to join in on self-assessment teams. Anybody who sets up a self-assessment team is assessing against something. So they say, we're going to do a self-assessment team on the storage of tools in the tool crib, to make sure that we're storing the tools properly, that they are being taken care of, that they're available when we need them, because if we don't have the tools in the tool crib, a machine could go down and we can't fix it, we can't produce our product. So we're going to self-assess. They're not going out and assessing against just, good practices. They have something written that says the storeroom must be locked between these hours. Only these people can get into the storeroom. There is some written document somewhere that they assess against. Whenever you hear we're going to do a self-assessment, join on that team. If you're allowed to join on the team, join on that team. And the reason you want to do that is you want to go firsthand to see what they're assessing against and assessing for. So you can say, aha, that's a security thing right there, and I didn't even know it existed. Now I need to close that gap. And it will help you ferret out those things. Read. Regulations, standards. Every organization has tons of standards documents. When you have nothing to do, get in the habit of reading other departments' operating procedures and standards, because you will find things hidden in there that say that, when completed, this particular intermediate, this part that we've made, we're making cars, let's say, and we made the front fenders. when the front fenders are all made, they must be stacked in this room and secured so that no one will scratch them. Well, when they use the word secured, what does that mean? They're in the room. If there's not a lock on the door, it's not secured. You will find references to security in a lot of other people's standards, and you need to talk to them about whether or not they're comfortable doing that completely themselves or they need your assistance to put it into your holistic program. If you're in a big firm, you probably have someone in legal affairs that reads the Federal Register. The Federal Register is a daily issue of the government that talks about the different administrative law changes that come out. And if indeed you have someone who does that, be sure to go introduce yourself to that person and tell them that you want to know about any changes in security regulations they may come across. You don't want to read that yourself. It's a book daily, so you don't want to do that. But make sure you talk to someone, if you are in a big company, that is tasked with looking for new regulations that come out on a daily basis and changes in administrative law. And then watch for department splits. And by that, I mean when a department is, you have the shipping department and it separates into the shipping department and the receiving department. You get an announcement that there's going to be two different people running a department. Sometimes they do that because there are regulatory reasons or quality reasons or some reason the split was made that has to do with the regulatory environment. And whenever you see a split in a department, when you go and congratulate those new leaders of that department, those two separate departments, ask them if there's any change in the security profile, in the regulations, in the internal controls that you need to be aware of to make them successful. Because oftentimes I found that has something to do with a regulatory change. They've separated because someone has to take on more responsibility to be compliant somewhere, and that's why they've done a split. So just a few extra tactics there. And based on that and the questions that you ask, I think you should be relatively comfortable that you can ferret out the regulations, the standards, and the internal controls that your company uses to be successful that may have a security component. So with that, this was a little different than some of the other lectures in that we didn't talk about a specific department, but we looked at it more holistically. We've really talked about the ESRM, about inviting different people in. We've given 3 examples with HR, facilities and engineering, and finance. And of course, you in your individual organizations, when you join one, may want to add, and I would encourage you to add IT and supply chain and whatever other R&D, if you have an R&D, any other function that you think is a major function that could have a security component tied to it, which is just about every one of them. We're not going to go over all of them because every organization is different. I think you get the idea. So now we're going to shift a little bit over the next several weeks into a more holistic look and things like the regulatory environment and your own department and security leadership. So this week you had a lecture, which you've just completed. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. A little longer than most, but hopefully enlightening. There's reading. There's a basic regulation to read. There's an article on standards from ISO, and there's a trade secret article, which I think puts it in perspective. They're a little hard to define. I think that article does one of the better jobs of defining trade secrets to help you understand that. There is a 10-question quiz that's just on this unit. I posted this lecture without the narration so that you can use that to take notes on and to use as a study guide. I'll do that from this point forward. And since our final exam is going to be a paper, you won't need to do that cumulative. So I don't think I have any other cumulative quizzes coming up. Reserve the right to do that, but for the most part, they will be on the unit that we were just discussing. So in this case, 10 questions on this particular unit. I don't think it's all that difficult, but you need to read the questions carefully. Having a great week is a deliverable. You guys had a break, and then you came back from a break, and now the weather's starting to turn, and you're getting your midterm grades. Things start to get serious. Everybody relax. Stay stress-free as much as you can. And with that, I just want to reinforce the idea that you can call me. You can text, you can call, you can write. If you need help, you want to talk about the assignments, you want to talk about your grades, you want to talk about the course, anything else, feel free to do so. I have talked to a number of you now via phone and via text message and others. I hope that you found that to be helpful. I hope I didn't stress anybody out too much. I want to make sure, because I'm not there on campus with you all the time, that you understand that I'm accessible. You'll see answers from me coming out at 5 a.m. and 10 p.m. And when I get your message, I will answer it. Within a few minutes of getting it, I normally can answer a message. The only issue is that I do sleep usually once a day. And so, if I go to bed early, you may end up waiting till the next morning to get an answer. But I try to answer everybody quickly. And if you do need to talk about something, don't be a stranger, okay? Let's make sure that we keep communication open because that's very important to everybody's success. With that, have a great week. Don't forget to do the quiz. There is no discussion due this week. Best of luck, and we will talk next week.